Being an adult Percy Jackson fan is kind of hard, you guys. I mean, on the one hand, if you join fandom spaces, you're probably going to be surrounded by teenagers who are mostly interested in shipping or fantasizing about which cabin they'd get to live in if they were half-bloods. All of which is perfectly fine, it's just not exactly within my scope of interest. And on the other hand, if I look at newspaper and blog posts about this universe written by adults, I just find a bunch of patronizing head-scratching of people thinking the books are either the worst curse upon literature ever devised, or like just don't see the appeal and never bothered to actually read them. Like the most that many adults can say about it is it's gotten their children into mythology enough to pick up read better books on the subject, and foster a willingness to visit Greco-Roman sections of museums.
I've even heard of several fans who grew up to study classics in university, so the general consensus on them is while they are obviously bad and stupid, at least they encourage genuine interest in a culturally significant field. I definitely take issue with that interpretation, but right now I want to address a far more baffling interpretation of these books that is a more recent development. This new reading sees the Percy Jackson universe as a bastion of American imperialism and white supremacy, which further perpetuates the lies of Western civilization. Now, I understand where this criticism is coming from, I just don't think the reality is as clear-cut as that. I can't help but wonder if the people making this argument are actually concerned about these books, or if they're just trying to make some controversial content in order to get clicks from angry fans like me. If so, mission accomplished. Cheers. This franchise was the first source I had for learning about Greek mythology at all, and they spurred a deep-rooted interest in the subject for me that's lasted well over a decade now. So as someone with a humanities background who's familiar with the controversy around the concept of the West, someone who is very well versed on all things Percy Jackson, and a mixed-race person, allow me to make a case in its defense. Oh, and spoiler warning for these books. Yeah. Part 1, The Heart of the West. In her blog post entitled The Problem with Percy Jackson, classicist Spencer McDaniel argues that the concept of the Heart of the West, or Flame of the West, is a clumsy and unnecessary explanation for why the gods are in America, and further that this part of Percy Jackson lore is an expression of American chauvinism. If the Percy Jackson in the Olympian series is defined by anything, it is the blending of Americana with elements from ancient Greek literature and mythology to send the explicit message that the United States is the new Greece. She points to the portion of The Lightning Thief in which Chiron explains this lore to Percy as evidence of her claims. What you call Western civilization. Do you think that's just an abstract concept? No, it's a living force, a collective consciousness that has burned bright for thousands of years. The gods are part of it. You might even say they are the source of it, or at least they are tied so tightly to it that they couldn't possibly fade, not unless all of Western civilization were obliterated. The fire started in Greece. Then, as you well know, the heart of the fire moved to Rome, and so did the gods. Oh, different names perhaps, Jupiter for Zeus, Venus for Aphrodite, and so on. But the same forces, the same gods. The gods simply moved to Germany, to France, to Spain for a while. Wherever the flame was brightest, the gods were there. They spent several centuries in England. And yes, Percy, of course, they are now in your United States. Like it or not, and believe me, plenty of people weren't very fond of Rome either. America is now the heart of the flame. It is the great power of the West, and so Olympus is here, and we are here. McDaniel reads this as an attestation that the Greek gods are meant to be interpreted as uniquely American now, that the other countries that have claimed them in the past, including Greece, no longer have claim to them according to the lore of the story. Obviously, these gods and characters are of fundamentally Greek origin, not American, so the portrayal of them this way is troubling to her. She writes, "Notice how Chiron characterizes the gods as having previously resided in other nations, but now they have left those other nations, and they reside solely in the United States. The point is clearly to emphasize that the Greek legacy no longer belongs to any of those other nations. According to Percy Jackson and the Olympians, everything the ancient Greeks did, every deed they accomplished, every story they told, now belongs to the United States." To be fair to McDaniel, she specifies that she doesn't have a problem with these stories being set in the United States per se, but she takes issue with the gods being portrayed as living in the United States and not in Greece. She argues the same plot might have worked fine if the gods were merely visiting the United States, but the concept of the Heart of the West is disconcerting because it places undue ownership of Greek history and culture on the US. But her argument really doesn't hold up if you keep reading past The Lightning Thief, and I'd hazard a guess that most people who read that book continued on with the pentology, and the one after that, and the one after that, despite her attestations that the first book is really the only one that matters because it's the one that's been adapted into movies and musicals and such, as if studios and producers regularly adapt a series starting from the second book.
The thing about that is that most fans, not all, but most, actually name the Battle of the Labyrinth as their favorite in this pentology, which is book 4 out of 5. And most people's favorite in the second pentology is The Son of Neptune, the 7th book in the franchise, and a book that introduces a metric ton of new lore expanding upon the rules of this universe. So to understand this debate better, let's fully flesh out the concept of the Heart of the West as explained in the whole Camp Half-Blood Chronicles, not just the first book, and how it actually does make sense within the context of real mythology and history, as well as being a fun bit of fantasy lore.
The first thing to connect this to the Greco-Roman mythological canon as we understand it today is the Roman Empire. Everyone knows that the Roman religion was based largely upon the ancient Greek religion. They actively claimed to be the direct inheritors of Greek tradition in their origin myth, which states that their society was based upon the son of Aphrodite or Venus. Obviously, the two religions are not 100% the same, and there are plenty of gods that are unique to Rome. The Romans also made changes to several of the originally Greek gods to line up more closely with their own cultural values. For example, the hot-headed violent Ares became more level-headed and strategic Mars. Romans were big on this thing called syncretism, where they essentially would conquer a country and then smoosh the local gods and their gods into the same god in order to establish cultural and religious stability between groups. For example, in Bath, England, the Celtic goddess Sulis was syncretized with Minerva, and because they became the largest empire on Earth at the time, Rome had huge influence, bringing aspects of their culture across Europe, Africa, and Asia. And centuries later, when formerly Roman Britain became the British Empire, those cultural elements were spread even further across the globe and to the Americas. So within the lore of Percy Jackson's world, when all of these socio-political changes happened, what happened was that the god sphere of influence simply grew larger. It didn't shift from one country to another. The gods didn't cease to be Greek when they became Roman, and they didn't cease to be Roman when they became Spanish or British or whatever. They merely became the gods of more and more places, the gods of so-called Western civilization as a whole, which is kind of reflected in the way countries all over the world have adopted them over the centuries in art and literature. Where the gods reside has to do with prosperity and power, not their sphere of influence. The gods are in the United States because the US is the most overpowered Western nation, not because they uniquely belong to Americans. And that doesn't mean that they can't leave or stopped belonging to Greece, or that their sacred places like Delos, Ephesus, and Olympia stop being sacred to them. It also doesn't mean that they have no influence in Western countries which have never been the heart of the flame. In the second pentology in the franchise, The Heroes of Olympus, one of the main protagonists is a Chinese-Canadian boy named Frank Zhang. As far as we know, Canada has never been the heart of the flame, yet Mars still manages to have a child there. Many point to Frank as the first non-American character in the franchise, however that honor actually goes to Nico and Bianca D'Angelo, who were born in Italy to an Italian mother in the early 1930s or 1920s, before emigrating to the US in the early days of World War II. Both first appear in the third volume of the first pentology, The Titan's Curse. The books state that the gods and Camp Half-Blood were in Great Britain until coming to the United States in the 1840s, meaning when Hades fathered Nico and Bianca in Italy, the gods were not living in Italy or even in Europe. And if you read all the way to the Hidden Oracle, Book 1 of Trials of Apollo, we meet a demigod at camp from Brazil, meaning one of the gods had a romance in South America, despite Brazil also never being mentioned to have ever been the Heart of the Flame. The only place ever mentioned to be beyond the god's scope of influence is Alaska, and that's because the gods native to that region are so powerful and terrifying that the Greek gods are powerless there. So all of this very clearly shows that the gods are no longer Greek and don't belong to America. They simply belong wherever they want to go. And that could change at any time. It has before and it will again, no question. So this is not intended to be an expression of American exceptionalism. The US isn't the best country in the world in this story. It is simply where the gods happen to be living at the moment. Part of Percy Jackson lore is the idea of demigods being the bridge between gods and mortals, and more importantly, the intense dependency that the gods have on mortals. You see, the gods are merely manifestations of our ideas about them, and our memory of them is what keeps them alive. They are the way mortals imagine them to be, the things mortals attribute to their various domains. That's why Poseidon looks like a fisherman, Zeus looks like an executive, Ares looks like a biker, and Aphrodite looks like a supermodel. And even that's an oversimplification because the gods often look different to different people. But they are sustained through mortals remembering them and their history. They are willed into existence through our imagination, and that is how they continue to exist. What people think about the gods matters more than what they were ever like in the past, canonically. And you can take issue with that if you like, but there is at least an explanation as to why they aren't depicted as accurately as some would prefer.
The major conflict of the first series is completely centered on this bit of lore. Because the demigods have so much influence over the mortal world, far more direct influence than the fates allow the gods to have, some of them have the power to bring down the gods. And the disagreement on the right thing to do is what drives the entire plot, with some demigods thinking that the gods and the West are fundamentally bad and broken and should be destroyed, and those who have their problems with the gods but don't believe that total destruction is the answer. And this is where I think the adult snobbery is really stopping people from understanding the deeper implications of this story, because if you only read The Lightning Thief, you wouldn't notice the fact that this story is actually very critical of the very idea of Western civilization.
Part 2. Imperialism and the West. Within academic circles, the debate over whether or not any such thing as the West even exists is actually very much still going on. Despite us all having taken some kind of class claiming to teach pan-Western theater, literature, or history, the concept of the West is dubious at best and complete lies at worst. See, the way the story normally goes is that back in antiquity, the Greeks invented philosophy and democracy and theater and art and so on, and then everyone else in Europe based their cultures on Greco-Roman traditions, so we're all basically the same thing, right? Except the reality is a lot more complicated. I mean, the dominant religions in Europe today are all from Asia, with the indigenous religions of Europe almost entirely wiped out. Lots of other cultures have ancient theatrical traditions totally independent of traditional Greek theater. So-called European food and drink staples like coffee, tea, and potatoes all originate from other continents. The Enlightenment era, the era in which Europeans made huge discoveries in the political, medicinal, and scientific fields, was often centuries behind Native American, Polynesian, African, and Asian people's store of knowledge passed down through generations. And I'm really only scratching the surface here. So in common usage, the West as a concept really only dates back to the 1800s, and its usage was primarily for distinguishing between good white people and bad non-white people. The ancient Greeks and Romans certainly did not view what we now call Europe as being homogeneous in any way. So this story we tell ourselves about Western civilization is just that. A story we've told ourselves. It's a framing device for understanding our history, but it isn't strictly factual or tangible. In his article, The Lightning Thief, Latent White Supremacy in Percy Jackson, Maxwell T. Paul argues that this book in particular is guilty of perpetuating a very white supremacist understanding of Greek mythology, imperialism, and a mythologized concept of the West. He writes, "This emphasis on the power of Western civilization, a concept that didn't emerge until the 19th century and was bound up in imperialism and colonialism, white supremacy, classism, and exceptionalism, absolutely pervades The Lightning Thief, as does an explicit emphasis on its divine lineage." Chiron later refers to the modern era as the time of Western civilization and the rule of Zeus, and equates the West with the very essence of civilization itself,
prior to which there was only darkness and chaos. Hell, one of the book's early battles is set atop the St. Louis Arch, known more properly as the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial, an edifice purported by the Undersecretary of the Interior John Carver Jr. to reflect the impulse of the age it memorializes, Western expansion as our manifest destiny. World War II is described as a fight between the sons of Zeus and Poseidon on one side, and the sons of Hades on the other, and among the list of notable divine offspring, Riordan lists William Shakespeare, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. And yes, it is only white men who are cited as famous demigods in this book. To put this distinction between gods and mortals into starker relief, Percy later receives a sword that can harm monsters and demigods, but learns from Chiron that the blade will pass through mortals like an illusion. They simply are not important enough for the blade to kill. Emphasis added to highlight the absurdity of this statement. So, first of all, that title. Very spicy. Well done. I don't want to be super unfair to Paul. Despite this clickbaity title and some of the more over-exaggerated points, the actual argument he makes is a lot more nuanced than it looks. He specifies that he's criticizing the appearance of tropes that predate Percy Jackson, rather than blaming Riordan for intentionally writing a racist story. He actually praises Riordan's grappling with this in later books and subverting these tropes. The problem I have with this article, though, is that it becomes apparent pretty quickly that he likely didn't read this book, and definitely didn't read any of its sequels. And the reason I think this is because he basically just reinterprets the contexts of certain quotes from the book and separates them from their clear meaning within the text in order to support his argument. But maybe I'm wrong. He could also be attempting to force the text into suiting his argument knowingly, which would be much worse. For example, his issue with mortals not being important enough for celestial bronze to harm because he thinks mortal is code for non-white doesn't really make sense in context. For one thing, there are a lot of non-white demigods, and we get many named non-white characters from Book 2 onwards. It's just that in Book 1, Percy doesn't really name any campers apart from Annabeth, Luke, and Clarice. This is a short book in which characters are only named and described if they are directly consequential to the plot. Paul also chooses to ignore the fact that the famous white demigods were named based on their recognition to 12-year-olds. The most well-known historical figures are white men, and while there is a racist and sexist history behind why that is, it's certainly not wrong for Uncle Rick to reference highly recognizable historical figures in his middle grade book, Now Is It? And can we talk about the fact that Paul is blaming Uncle Rick for setting one scene in this road trip book at a highly recognizable famous monument that happens to also have a racist history? How dare he set a scene at a place? The nerve! I'm sorry, but if you're setting a book in the United States, you'd be hard-pressed to find any famous monuments that don't have a horrible history behind them. One author cannot magically undo the very limited version of history that American children are taught, and it would be unrealistic to expect that. He's trying to ground this story in things that children are very familiar with, and that's totally understandable. As for his problems with the magical swords, the lore about celestial bronze is basically just a fantasy trope to make the story more child-appropriate, and to draw a sharp line between violence against monsters and against people. Celestial bronze and imperial gold are metals which are either forged by the gods or imbued with godly power in the past, which gives them the ability to harm monsters and gods. It's a consistent theme that only the morally corrupt use mortal weapons, because this would be a demigod using their skills to commit violence against humanity. The only characters who use steel weapons within the franchise are villains, and it's always framed as a special evil. Percy is shown to refuse to harm demigods and mortals, even if it risks his own life, because he is so morally averse to the idea of harming any humans. The simply not important enough line isn't meant to be taken literally. It's meant to refer to the fact that the fates heavily restrict the gods within the lore of this series, even more than in ancient times. Very rarely are they able to, for example, directly kill a mortal. So it makes sense that the godly weapons would not work on mortals. You could maybe argue that it could have been worded better, but I don't think there's any other interpretation of this within context. While demigods are capable of killing people, it's the imperative of the camp to prevent this, and therefore they arm demigods with godly weapons useful for defending themselves from monsters, but that cannot be used to perpetuate violence against humanity. Paul's interpretation of the whole Age of Zeus thing is also way off, and I think if he actually read the entire conversation this quote appears in, he should know this. Like, it's very clear that by the age of Western civilization, Chiron means all of human history, even before Mycenaean Greece. The era of darkness and chaos mentioned is not supposed to mean any time before Hellenistic Greece perfected the world with their white ethnocentrism. The era of darkness is supposed to mean a time before Prometheus gave fire to mankind. This is a reference to Hesiod's Theogony, and how he says that the entire universe sprang from the emptiness of chaos, the state of nothingness from which all primordial gods, titans, humans, and regular gods were born. So yeah, chaos, darkness. This is really not hard to piece together. And FYI, the primordial gods play a huge antagonistic role in the heroes of Olympus, which further supports my reading. That said, I do agree with Paul that there are some iffy choices in this book. It's problematic AF to have made Medusa have an accent and wear a burqa, full covering with a veil over the eyes. I won't try to excuse that, but it's important to remember that this book was published in 2005 when the social consciousness around Islamophobia was not anywhere near where it is today. These books are nearly 2 decades old, and there are many things in them we'd consider offensive today. There's a word used twice in the second book we now consider to be an ableist slur, but was once commonly used by children. These are some of the things I hope are changed in the adaptation process for the Disney Plus TV show. This stuff isn't acceptable, but we should understand it within context. And FYI, Riordan did go on to write a series in which one of the main protagonists is a Muslim hijabi teenager, offering readers some positive representation of Muslim women, a fact which is rarely brought up when Rick is criticized for his depiction of Medusa. I'm not going to claim that there are absolutely no hints of white supremacy within these books, because it is an idea that permeates much of Eurocentric culture, with white supremacy being so tied up in the very concept of the West. But this kind of feels like someone looking hard for connections that aren't substantial, or thinking they're doing some top-notch analysis when they've barely glossed over the details. I think if he closely read the entire franchise and became deeply familiar with the material, Paul would probably come to the conclusion that this story is actually highly critical of the concept of Western civilization in ways that become increasingly obvious as you move through it. One thing that's really vital to the plot of Percy Jackson and the Olympians is that there has been a prophecy that states that if a demigod child of the eldest gods reaches 16, they will have the power to destroy or save the Olympians by making a choice of some kind. And while there are some plot contrivances that don't make this immediately certain, in the end the only person this prophecy could refer to is Percy. The big bad of PJO is Kronos, the ruler of the Titans and father of the elder Olympians. But in a much truer way, the antagonist of the series is a demigod child of Hermes named Luke Castellan. He spent years training to fight on behalf of the gods, on behalf of a father that doesn't appear to care for him, and he's become completely disillusioned with all of it. He is convinced by Kronos that the gods are evil and that Western civilization is profoundly evil, and that in order for the world to heal, they must be eradicated. And within the text, he has some understandable grievances and valid points about the gods being essentially selfish, violent, and morally deficient. At first, Percy takes it for granted that Luke is wrong and is merely being brainwashed, but over the next several years, Percy is confronted again and again with evidence that the gods, and by extension the West, are perhaps not as good as he believes, and that maybe the reason he defends them has more to do with familial obligation than any objective good that they do, and questions whether his efforts are worth the trouble. He definitely doesn't think total destruction is the solution, but he becomes more critical of the gods over the course of the story, and seriously considers leaving them to their fate. The prophecy is fulfilled in a way that nobody expected, as prophecies typically do, and the choice that Percy makes to save or destroy the world is basically a choice between violence and surrender. When it comes down to it, Percy chooses to surrender. and that choice ultimately saves the Olympians. But when he's making the choice, he isn't really thinking about the gods as much as he's thinking about the people he cares for, his friends and his family. The gods offer to turn Percy into a god for his service, and he instead asks that the gods fundamentally change. They must actually claim and care for their children. They must protect them and accept them all. And they must stop punishing their enemies for offenses committed in ages past. And in the final chapter of the book, Percy notes that a lot of the new demigods safely brought to Camp Half-Blood are from countries all over the world. When I was a child, I loved this ending because of the personal triumph that Percy enabled for all the demigod children who had been neglected. But as an adult, I read more into the symbolism of it, and read it as a critique of American exceptionalism and Western imperialism, and a direct refutation of the idea that America is the inheritor of ancient Greece. Rather than choosing personal glory and advancement, Percy uses his power to force change into the gods, the very embodiment of the West, and make them atone for their sins. But he also forces them to stop excluding whole groups of their children, to actually recognize them all as their descendants. That's really quite powerful messaging in my view, but it's messaging you'd completely miss if you only read book 1 and no further. But if you did read further and made your way through Heroes of Olympus, you'd probably notice that the gods are a lot less important in that story than in the first one. And not just because of the whole demigod embargo plot contrivances that happen. That's whatever. No. I mean their importance to the protagonists in the story. In PJO, Percy spends a lot of time directly helping the gods, either by saving them from traps, going on fetch quests for them, or doing favors for them and whatnot. But in Heroes, the motivation for basically all the protagonists is to protect their loved ones. The big threat is that Gia will awaken and destroy the demigods and all human life. When they go into battle, they worry about their mortal families. It becomes clear that basically all the demigods are really over-caring about the gods, and most feel pretty hostile towards them. They stop fighting for the Olympians, the West, and instead fight for each other, for humanity as a whole, for the entire world. And you could definitely argue that I'm just reading too much into this, or that I'm adding a bunch of context that isn't there. After all, these are books written for a middle grade audience, and the general view tends to be that these sorts of books don't have deeper critical aspects to them like literature for adults. I can't claim to know exactly what was going on in Rick Riordan's mind when he was writing these books. All I can do is refer to the texts themselves to support my interpretation and hope that my analysis has some merit. So in the spirit of literary analysis, let's turn to what's, in my opinion, the crowning jewel of the Percy Jackson universe, and also one of the greatest pieces of evidence to support my reading of these texts. Let's take a good long look at the Trials of Apollo. Part 3, Trials of Apollo. So here's your spoiler warning, because I'm about to completely spoil the entire plot of the Trials of Apollo in this section. I give this warning because the final volume of this series was only released in 2020, and even many longtime fans have not gotten around to reading it yet. The fact that Percy is not a major character in the series made a lot of fans think they wouldn't enjoy it, but Percy is still a minor character, and the rest of the cast makes appearances throughout the story. The premise of this series is that, due to certain plot shenanigans that happened in the preceding series, the god Apollo has been punished by Zeus to take the mortal form of a 15-year-old boy and be cast down from Olympus and cut off from all godly aid. He must work in the service of a demigod, specifically the standoffish 12-year-old daughter of Demeter, Meg McCaffrey. Over the course of the first volume, The Hidden Oracle, Meg and Apollo, who is given the alias Lester Papadopoulos, discover that the Oracle of Delphi has been retaken by the monster Python, and that he and his accomplices are working to gain control of all of the most important oracles from Greek mythology in order to have monopoly over the future. This would prevent the demigods from being able to avert crises and protect the world, because prophecies from oracles are the instigating forces behind every quest, and without the prophetic insight they provide, none of their future missions will succeed. It also, more troublingly, interferes with the Fates' ability to spin destiny for anyone anymore, because at any moment Python could make a new prophecy and completely change the future of the world. In the climax of The Hidden Oracle, we discover that Python's accomplices are actually 3 former emperors of Rome, who have become immortal via the same supernatural forces that allow the gods to exist. Remember, the gods sustain their immortality through worship and the collective consciousness of humanity, and are affected and changed by the way mortals perceive or imagine them over time. If a god is forgotten, or their domain becomes irrelevant or desecrated, they slowly fade out of existence. It's like the godly version of dying.
But because the Caesars of Rome often branded themselves as living gods and encouraged people to worship them, upon their deaths, 3 of them were reborn as minor gods and have been slowly amassing power and wealth in the shadows over the centuries under their corporation known as Triumvirate Holdings. As history went on and their names lived more in infamy, the Caesars became more and more powerful as they came to occupy greater prominence in the collective consciousness and became emulated by mortal rulers and governments. Thank goodness for the Renaissance when our classical greatness was remembered. And then came the internet. Oh, gods, I love the internet. It's impossible for me to fade completely now. I am immortal on Wikipedia. The 3 Caesars in question are Nero, Commodus, and Caligula, who have divided North America into 3 regions for each of them to rule. Nero rules the east, Caligula rules the west, Commodus rules the middle portion.
Now, this premise is great for many reasons. Firstly, throwing a Greek god and a few Roman emperors into the modern day creates some amazing opportunities for jokes. It also creates a situation in which we are privy to the personal thoughts, feelings, and memories of Apollo, who narrates the series. Apollo doesn't have access to his full memories in his mortal form, but occasionally a tidbit slips through and we get some really fun portrayals of historical events and historical people, as seen through the eyes of a self-obsessed immortal being. He's also not afraid to spill the tea on the other gods. We get the sense from him that the gods aren't bastions of glory as much as they are quite toxic people. Some are bullies, tyrants, some are selfish or cruel. The gods have power, but they often lack important qualities like bravery, compassion, forethought, empathy, and kindness. Apollo at first is so selfish and self-centered, so detached from the world, it's funny. But he offers a lot of insight too. He remembers fictionalized details about the past that are enlightening and compelling. In the days of antiquity, mythological Apollo functioned as a sort of liberator of slaves. So Riordan's Apollo ruminates on his passionate hatred of slavery. Mythological Apollo is infamous for his many disastrous relationships, and this is a source of great shame and grief for Riordan's Apollo, who struggles with the feeling that he is ultimately a destructive person undeserving of love, and shields from this fear via a facade of narcissism. But it also provides an excellent pretext for addressing some of the more pernicious aspects of so-called Western civilization. In the last 2 volumes of the series, our protagonists learn that if they are going to defeat the emperors, they must destroy the fasces in which they have concentrated the bulk of their power. This was the first time I'd ever heard of fasces, and I was 25 when I first read The Tyrant's Tomb, so I imagine most children have never heard of them. Basically, fasces were a symbol of power within the Roman Republic and Empire, and are still used as a symbol of power in many republics, including the United States. They are also inexorably tied to the legacy of fascism, whose name is derived from the symbol. Fasces were carried by magistrates or priests as a way to show their authority, and this philosophy of showboating your power was eventually carried over into fascism. Nero, Commodus, and Caligula chose to concentrate their power into the fasces in order to better channel their power among each other. If one of them dies, their power merely flows into the others. Cutting off one head makes the other stronger. The emperors in Riordan's story can only be defeated after all of their fasces, their images, have been broken, at which point they become mortal men once again. The series prominently features demigods actively fighting against the Caesars, literally violently rejecting their imperial agenda. I'm not really sure what other reading of this one could have except as a direct rejection of imperialism and fascism. And what I find really subversive about this is the fact that Riordan is criticizing the legacy of Rome in a way that most politicians and even historians won't. So much emphasis is placed upon the glory of the Roman Republic when it was almost exactly as oligarchical as the empire that followed it. And yet basically every republican state on earth thrills in associating itself with Rome, in spite of, or perhaps because of, its imperialist, oligarchical history. Historically, Americans have used Rome as an excuse for the perpetuation of some of our worst crimes, namely slavery and colonialism, a fact that Riordan explicitly criticizes in The Mark of Athena. She remembered reading how the American South had often compared itself to Rome back before the Civil War. In the old days, their society had been about impressive architecture, honor, and codes of chivalry, and on the evil side, it had also been about slavery. Rome had slaves, some Southerners argued, so why shouldn't we? The houses and the gardens were very beautiful, very Roman, but she wondered why beautiful things had to be wrapped up with evil history. Or was it the other way around? Maybe the evil history made it necessary to build beautiful things, to mask the darker aspects. And Rick doesn't just make this point once. He goes back to it again in Trials of Apollo. In Book 4, Apollo and Meg arrive at Camp Jupiter, the enclave for Roman demigods near Oakland, California. Unlike Camp Half-Blood, which is pretty much just a children's summer camp, Camp Jupiter has a small city with its own economy, schools, and everything. Demigods are found and recruited as children, they are trained as part of a real Roman legion tasked with defending the city, and after 10 years of service are able to retire and leave, or live in the city of New Rome, where they can find other work or go to college in safety from monstrous threats. Since Apollo remembers what the original Rome was like, his perception of New Rome is pretty interesting, and it further perpetuates this criticism of the idealized version of Rome that we often hear. It was not the same as ancient Rome, of course. They'd made quite a few improvements. No slavery, for one thing. Better personal hygiene for another. Gone was the subura. Walking through the forum, I heard conversations in a dozen languages, Latin among them. Children played in the fountains while adults sat nearby under trellises shaded with grapevines. This was a smaller, kinder, much improved Rome. The Rome we always thought mortals were capable of, but never achieved. At the time Apollo and Meg arrive in New Rome, the two people in charge of this mini-society are a Puerto Rican young woman and a Chinese-Canadian young man. And at the end of the book, the Puerto Rican girl steps down and is replaced by a black girl from New Orleans whose grandmother was born into slavery. That's a whole other backstory, just roll with it. The multiculturalism of New Rome is framed by Apollo as one of its most positive attributes, and it is this multicultural community who violently resists the imperial agenda of the triumvirate in the story, rejecting their supposed glory and authority to forge a better path. This symbolism is so blatant that if you think I'm just reading into things in Percy Jackson, I defy you to honestly claim that I'm just reading into all of this. I think adults often make the mistake of assuming that children are simple-minded and aren't capable of absorbing subtler messaging in their media. But children are little sponges that are constantly absorbing information when we aren't even aware. That's how children learn racism, sexism, homophobia, and many other culturally prominent prejudices, even if they've never heard someone go on a long bigoted rant before. Sometimes children understand symbolism better than adults because they're less likely to obsess over the details and will accept a story as it is rather than focusing on what's silly. If you think about fairy tales like Cinderella, nobody has to explain to children that the point of the story is to show that being kind and considerate will make your life better in the long run, rather than being self-centered and selfish. The story explains that for them without needing to spell it out. In the same way, nobody who grew up reading Harry Potter needed to be told directly that sometimes the media isn't fully trustworthy and can be influenced by those in power to push a particular narrative, or can be pressured to publish certain perspectives and ignore others. The story imparts that message on its own. So I think it's wrong to assume that children don't understand themes and messaging. Sure, maybe not all of them will understand it, but that doesn't mean that they lack the capacity to understand it. And I think a middle school reader is probably very capable of understanding that in Percy Jackson, the gods are not the good guys. They're powerful beings, but it's just a reality that those with power, be they Olympian gods, titans, primordial gods, or Roman emperors, are not necessarily those who are in the right. And I want to be perfectly clear. I am not saying that the message here is that the West is bad and must be destroyed. That's definitely not what the text implies. Percy doesn't let the gods die, after all. What it is saying is, yes, there is ugly stuff in our past. There is violence, bigotry, apathy, all kinds of other stuff. But it doesn't have to stay that way. We can build a better world, a kinder world. We just have to decide to do it. In her article for The New Yorker titled The Percy Jackson Problem, Rebecca Mead references a lecture given by author Neil Gaiman, which The Guardian thankfully transcribed for posterity, in which he gives his opinion that when it comes to children, all reading is a good thing. I don't think there is such a thing as a bad book for children. Every now and again it becomes fashionable among some adults to point at a subset of children's books, a genre perhaps, or an author, and to declare them bad books, books that children should be stopped from reading. It's tosh, it's snobbery, and it's foolishness. Do not discourage children from reading because you feel they are reading the wrong thing. Well-meaning adults can easily destroy a child's love of reading. stop them reading what they enjoy, or give them worthy but dull books that you like, the 21st century equivalent of Victorian improving literature. You'll wind up with a generation convinced that reading is uncool, and worse, unpleasant. Mead isn't entirely convinced by this perspective. She admits that her son's interest in Percy Jackson has indeed resulted in an overall genuine interest in Greco-Roman mythology, to the point that he knows more about it as a tween than she does as an adult. She writes, "If an indelible association between Ares and the Hell's Angels lingers in these young readers' minds, such may be the price of their mythological literacy." However, this fact is not enough to dissuade her discomfort with the simplistic, slang-heavy language found in Percy's narration style. There is a deep-seated anxiety that this will not result in children being interested in reading in general, because the more gimmicky language is so unlike the more serious and poetic language of other, read better, literature. And further, she attaches this quality judgment to children who would prefer Delaire's Book of Greek Myths over Percy Jackson books. I suspect it would be a very discerning elementary or middle school student who would choose the old version over the Percy Jackson retelling. Put the books side by side and the Delaire's will look more like the dull airs, as Percy and his demigod pals might put it. This view is implicitly shared by Spencer McDaniel, who writes, "By this point, I was 13 years old, and I had really outgrown the Percy Jackson books, as well as all the other modern retellings of Greek myths. Instead of reading Rick Riordan, I was reading works of actual ancient Greek literature, in translation, of course." Try as I might, it's very hard not to imagine her writing this whilst sipping tea from a fine china set. But this really comes at the root of the problem here, I think. Most adults believe that categories of high culture and low culture really exist, and that the overconsumption of low culture will result in the inability or unwillingness to appreciate high culture. But the reality is that what is considered high art is historically flexible and essentially made up. What is pop culture trash in one decade becomes high art a few decades later. The entire category of high art is meaningless. All art is art. All literature is literature, whether it be comic books or the works of Charles Dickens. And I'm not just saying that to make a point. This is an accepted fact in many academic fields. When I was doing my master's degree in cultural studies, basically the first thing we learned is that all culture is real culture and tells us something important about the world and the people who live within it. All culture is worth analyzing, even gimmicky children's books. And in a way, that might be Maxwell Paul's whole point when he criticized Riordan's inclusion of potential white supremacy. Maybe he is the only one in this trio to understand that subliminal messaging can and will be understood by young readers. His anxiety comes then not from the fear that children will not be discerning enough, but that they may internalize a bad message from these books. And I commend him for worrying about that. The only problem is that he forgot to actually read them. When I was a kid, the big controversial book series was Harry Potter. There was a huge moral panic that these books would teach children that the occult was good, actually, and would turn kids into theistic Satanists. My own mother really believed this for a long time, but as we got older, we did end up seeing some of the movies. She really loved the story, and one of the things she noticed was just how full of biblical references it was, which she might have known sooner if she'd actually read them before judging them. Adults have a really bad habit of condemning books that they've never read or judging an entire series by one installment, and it leads to a lot of really bad analysis that turns out to be categorically false upon closer inspection. And now that all the Harry Potter hot takes have been made and forgotten, I have an inkling that Percy Jackson is the next culprit, and that these hot takes are only just beginning. When the Disney Plus show comes out, I expect there to be tons of hot takes about it from people who've never read the books or only read the first one. Scores of adults will stir up a moral panic about a non-existent problem and convince themselves it's true without checking for themselves, and patronize young readers everywhere by implying they're too stupid to understand what they're reading, while simultaneously freaking out about the possible subliminal messages they're absorbing. Hopefully, when the question is raised, some of those parents will find this video and it will motivate them to ignore the moral panic and just let their children read. The benefits generally outweigh any potential risks.
As Neil Gaiman says, what fiction does for us is build our empathy. You get to feel things, visit places and worlds you would never otherwise know. You learn that everyone else out there is a me as well. You're being someone else, and when you return to your own world, you're going to be slightly changed. Maybe I'm biased because I studied literature, but I think Neil is right about that. A lot of the problems we have in the world today are all problems of empathy, of being unable to relate to or understand people who are different from us. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we've ended up here while also pushing the idea in the last few decades that literature, philosophy, history, and the other humanities are not worth studying or learning. The humanities are fields of cultural universals. They're the foundation upon which all modern scholarship is founded. Without them, society as we know it would not exist. There would be no democracy, no education, no media, nothing. And fundamentally, what this series is about is reckoning with the way things are and being willing to fight for things to be better. It's about helping kids to recognize the power that they've already got, their ability to improve the world through their actions. As Neil Gaiman put it, you're also finding out something as you read, vitally important for making your way in the world. And it's this: the world doesn't have to be like this. Things can be different.